Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burgess-Watson. Coming up on today's programme, after a rocky start, the ceasefire between Israel and Iran appears to be holding. We'll be asking, could it give rise to a long-term peace agreement? And could it pave the way to a truce in Gaza? Hello and welcome. We begin with the latest on the ceasefire between Iran and Israel, which brought to an end 12 days of hostilities. Well, US President Donald Trump, who played a central role in brokering that ceasefire, says that the US strikes carried out in the early hours of Sunday morning had resulted in, quote, the total obliteration of Iran's nuclear capabilities. And he says it set the country's atomic program back by decades. Well, Israel says it's still too early to fully assess the damage. Nevertheless, the international community has reacted with cautious optimism to the truce, and there are growing calls for a truce in Gaza as well to complement the Iran ceasefire. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to General Joseph Votel, former commander of the US Central Command and a retired four-star general. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Always a pleasure speaking to you, General Votel. I'd like to start by asking for your reaction to the end, or the conclusion, I should say, of these hostilities between Iran and Israel. Does it look to you, first of all, like the ceasefire is holding?
Thank you. It's good to be with you. Yeah, I think it does look like the ceasefire is holding. I know that it was a little bit of a difficult start, but I think the president, certainly our president, has clarified his expectations to both sides here, and so for these last 24 hours, it seems to be holding. You know, with regard to the first part of your question, I mean, I think what has really struck me over the last 12 or 13 days has just been the significant shifts and the surprises that have taken place. You know, first of all, with the strength of the Israeli initial attacks, and then the responses by Iran, and of course the entry into this by the United States on Saturday evening, going after the 3 nuclear sites, and then of course, really just within about 48 hours after that, to be at a place where we were working on a ceasefire. I think it just shows the sweeping changes that are taking place across the Middle East, and certainly in this particular area.
I mean, this was, of course, the deadliest ever confrontation between Israel and Iran. I'd just like to ask you, what was achieved? What were the most important, most significant achievements of these last 12 days?
Well, I think the most important achievement has largely been one that is military, and it has been to really strategically weaken Iran and its capabilities. Iran has built most of their military and security capabilities around long-range standoff weapons, around proxies, and around the nuclear weapons program. So certainly Israel, through their series of strikes, has deeply disrupted their surface-to-air missile launching capability. A lot of those missiles have been expended in retaliation fires, and a large number of those have been shot down. And Israel has largely taken out a lot of their manufacturing process for these types of missiles. So this is, I think, pretty significant. We've seen the impact that they've had on the proxies, particularly Hezbollah, Hamas, and certainly seems that the Iranian militia groups in Iraq and in Syria seem to be deterred, at least for the time being, in terms of taking any action. And then, of course, we know that the object of the activities over the last week has really been the nuclear weapons program that has largely been, I think, set back to some degree. I know there's some debate about how long that is, and we'll have to see what the final assessment is, but I think it's fair to say that there's been significant damage done to that program, and Iran's ability to weaponized enriched uranium is and then turn it into something that can be used against Israel or others has been severely set back.
Sure, and we'll talk a bit more about that in just a moment. But I mean, in terms of that US strike in the early hours of Sunday morning local time, I mean, how important, how crucial was that US military involvement in terms of bringing this conclusion to a decisive end? Bringing this conflict, I should say, to a decisive end?
Yeah, I think that it was extraordinarily conclusive and decisive in terms of this. Obviously is a contingency which we have prepared for a long period of time, and frankly, as somebody who's involved in that, as I watched it take place, it was a little bit surreal to do that. But I think what it did, the strength of it, the precision of it, the limited focus of it, directly aimed at the nuclear weapons program, I think sent an unmistakable message to not only Iran, but the rest of the world that we will not allow this to happen, and that we will not allow a nuclear weapon to be in a position where it can be used as a threat to Israel, to others across the region or globally. So I think it was a decisive aspect, and I think it was kind of the crown on top of what had been a very successful campaign by Israel of reducing Iran's military capabilities over the previous 8 or 9 days.
Do you think there's some frustration in Israel amongst people who would have liked to see Israel go further in terms of achieving more? Because, as you said, there were some victories on the battlefield for the Israelis. There have been a significant number of intelligence victories for the Israelis. Do you think they would have wanted to go further and not be told on Tuesday, as they were by President Trump, that a ceasefire had come into effect and that was that?
Well, that may be the case. I'm sure there are some that within Israel that, excuse me, would have preferred to continue to strike at Iran. But the prime minister, obviously, in talking with the president, reached the conclusion that this was the time to put a ceasefire in place and to hopefully move this into a different medium where we can actually begin to have discussions and negotiations about solidifying this, move it more into the political diplomatic realm. So, yeah, I mean, I think ceasefires are ultimately about compromise, frankly. Not everybody gets everything that they want. And that may be the situation here, but the fact of the matter is, I think for the greater good, the determination was we're ready to move to something else now.
Yeah, I mean, things seem to be panning out more or less as you would have hoped, I think, because when you spoke on Fox News on Friday, you said that if the military option was chosen, which it was, about 12 hours later, it should be accompanied by diplomatic outreach, which seems to be what you're saying now and seems to be what's happening. So you must be watching all of this and thinking, actually, things are panning out exactly as you think they should have done.
Well, yeah, I think that's right. I'm not any kind of prognosticator here in terms of this. I think my experience as a military officer is that there are certain things that military capabilities can do. They can compel people, they can change conditions on the ground, they can deter people. But ultimately, in any confrontation, you have to get to a political discussion. You have to get to a diplomatic resolution of the situation. That's how we solve these problems long term. And the military certainly has an incredible role in that, and so does economics, and so does the power of information. But diplomacy really has to come into its own in all of these situations, really to address the deep underlying issues. And this won't be an easy one. This will be a difficult discussion. It'll take some time, and it will be, again, dissatisfying to some people. But it's the way that we have to move forward, I believe.
Sure. I mean, it's been a tumultuous few days. It's been a tumultuous week, quite frankly, because the week began with that Iranian reprisal attack on the military base in Qatar. President Trump then sort of went down the ceasefire route pretty shortly thereafter. Do you think President Trump was right to shrug that reprisal attack off in the way that he did?
I do. I mean, I don't want to minimize the threat here. I mean, these are 14 ballistic missiles, each carrying about 1,500 pounds of explosives. If they had got through, they could certainly do some damage and cause casualties on the ground. So it's not insignificant. I'm sure the state of Qatar has a view on this as well, since it was into their airspace that these missiles were fired. But I think what the president was looking for, I think, frankly, what Iran was looking for was a way to de-escalate the current cycle of conflict that had taken place. And it appears the United States, along with our Qatari partners, were able to defeat that threat pretty readily. And so, as serious as that might have been, we were able to take care of it, and that provided, I think, a platform for the president to say, okay, let's now move to a different place here. We don't need another retaliatory round of escalation here.
President Trump faced some opposition from people in his own party to doing what America did on Saturday night, Sunday morning. Some Republicans thought that it was a mistake to engage the United States militarily in another faraway conflict. Would you say that, based up until the point we're at now, this has all been a vindication for President Trump?
Well, yeah, I would say that it seems to be going the direction that that is favorable to the United States, and I think really favorable to the parties and to the region moving forward. So I think that's a good thing. I would just point out there is some fatigue in our nation here with our engagement in the Middle East, and whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria or other things like this. These have been a heavy toll on the American people, and this was a very significant action. And the president took an extraordinary amount of risk with this, political risk as well as military and strategic risk with it. And the outcomes weren't completely certain on the other side of this. So that it is moved in the right direction, I think, is very fortuitous, and that's good. But I think what you probably heard was people concerned about the risk of, what happens on the other side of this? Are we now engaged in another long-term conflict? Do we know what's going to happen? It seems to be going in the right direction, but I don't know that was all that certain, or late last week or in the early hours after our strike.
Okay, so the military aspect of things is sort of to one side. It seems, as we've been saying, the ceasefire is holding. Now turning to sort of the diplomatic chapter of this conflict. I mean, are we hearing the sorts of noises from Tehran, the signals that you're hearing from Tehran? Are they telling you that the leadership in Tehran is willing to engage diplomatically and to try to move on?
I think there's been some indications of that. My understanding was this morning the Iranian president indicated that they are ready to move forward. There's also been some of the normal rhetoric that we would expect from the Iranians, them claiming victory in this, and expounding on some of their previous ideological views here in terms of this. So I think some of that is to be expected, but I think there has been some overtures in this, and I do think the Iranians have an appreciation, whether they are expressing it publicly or not, that they have been severely affected here over the last week, and many of their goals have been set back in significant ways. So yeah, I think there is some. I think it'll take some time. I think this is going to be it's going to be really important for the United States and for other interlocutors in the region and outside of the region to really kind of come together and in kind of a full court press, try to get the parties together and begin what I think will be a very difficult discussion and negotiation process moving forward. But yeah, I think there is some of that, and certainly there will be some political ramifications of this as well. And after some of the previous blow-ups in Iran, we've seen them come back and go after people, go after alleged spies and others. I think some of that is taking place. That will not be good internally to Iran, but that's part of the makeup of all of this, I believe.
And what about on the Israeli side? Obviously, we've heard the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declaring victory after that 12-day war. But do you think, when it comes to diplomacy, and obviously Israel will go into any diplomatic engagement feeling like it has the upper hand, I'm assuming, if they've claimed victory, Do you think they want to engage with the leadership in Iran?
I don't know. I really can't speak for the government of Israel. I think they will look to the United States to play kind of a leading, perhaps initial leading role in terms of these discussions and getting people to the table and having meaningful discussions about the kind of the big issues. I think what will be important is the Israelis clearly will try to highlight the things that are most important to them, which would be a renunciation of previous, dialogue coming from the Iranians directed at the Israeli state and its existence. I think that'll be important to get reversed, and then of course their acknowledgement that they're not going to seek a nuclear weapons program. I think those will all be very important. I think that's what I think is so important about the discussion. There's going to have to be some parsing of the big issues that have to be discussed in this, and that's going to take a little bit of time in this. And whether the Israelis are directly engaged or not, I do think they will rely on the United States and perhaps some other partners to maybe take the lead in this, and then at the appropriate time become part of the discussions. I think they have to be. I think all parties have to be involved in this.
Just as a wrap up this conversation, General Votel, I mean, there have been Israeli strikes that have hit the nuclear targets and U.S. strikes that have hit the nuclear targets. There have been various military targets that have been hit. We've seen scientists, significant military figures being killed by the Israelis. I mean, to what extent do you think the Iranian leadership has been weakened? Or perhaps do you think, as some people do, this has all had the opposite effect? It's got people rallying around the flag there in Iran. Which one is it?
Well, I think there's probably a little bit of nationalism going on and people rallying around this, but I think the bigger sentiment is that the supreme leader is more isolated today than he was previously. Many of the key leaders around him have been removed by the Israelis. He is old, he is sick. They are in the process of selecting replacements for him, here in the future, and they are disconnected. They have largely been off the grid here for fear of being targeted by the Israelis. So, I think their leadership capacity, I think, has been undermined significantly in the last few days. And so I do think there is a significant amount of isolation that has taken place, particularly around the supreme leader. And I think it will probably force, hopefully, some kind of recognition and some kind of discussion within the Iranian elite here about what form their government takes going forward here. I don't necessarily think there'll be a change. I think there'll probably be a next supreme leader, but who that person is and the direction that they go, I think will be a very good indication of what the next few years or decades are going to look like in Iran. So I think there's a lot of internal reflection that has to take place here as they come out of this brief, but I think very devastating war that they've had with both the United States and Israel.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed. We really appreciate your time and your analysis. General Joseph Votel, former commander of U.S. Central Command. Thank you very much indeed for your time, sir.
Thank you.
Let's get more now from David Hale, who is a former U.S. Special Envoy for Peace in the Middle East. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Some are framing that 12-day war, as it's been dubbed, as a victory for Israel, a forced surrender for Iran. Does that sound right to you, or is that a bit too simplistic?
Well, I do think that's the headline. Clearly, the tables have turned on the Iranians after many, many years in which they were basically calling the shots in terms of the use of violence in the Middle East. And for now, anyway, those days are behind us. So the real question is, with this change in the balance of power in the Middle East, what are we going to do to consolidate it and make sure everyone who's a partner of ours benefits?
Are you confident the ceasefire is going to hold?
Yes, I do think, I mean, there's always the possibility of something unexpected happening, but I think both sides, frankly, have an interest in this. The Iranians clearly can barely tolerate any further exchanges, and it'll be even more humiliating for the regime. And I think the attack on Al-Udeid demonstrated a desire to call it quits. And for the Israelis, they can claim now that they've reached their objective, despite conflicting reports of at least setting back the Iranian nuclear program. And I think it'd be hard to explain to the Israeli people continued sacrifices in light of that information.
I just want to pick up on what you were saying there. I mean, has the US, in your opinion, with its daring operation under the cover of darkness in the early hours of Sunday morning, eliminated the Iranian nuclear threat, in your view, or just delayed it? What sounds more likely to you?
Well, I think delay. I think even in the best of scenarios, the Iranians will always have, unless we are very vigilant, the potentiality of resuming their program. How extensive the damage is, I don't think anyone knows, despite various claims. This report from our Defense Intelligence Agency, which is just one of many agencies, was preliminary. And so I think we have to wait for the battlefield assessment. The important thing in my mind is the balance of power has changed. The Iranians are clearly seeking an end to this conflict, and that's an opportunity for us to consolidate that shift, that reversal of fortune that Iran has suffered because of this military activity.
In an article that was published on the Lebanese news website, Ici Beirut, or This is Beirut, you emphasize the importance of what happens next strategically. Let me ask you, what does need to happen next, in your opinion?
Well, obviously, we have to make sure the ceasefire holds. That's critically important. But I think it's also important for us to learn lessons from the past and not let the Iranians come rushing to us for a half-baked peace agreement in which we make concessions that are not necessary. I think what's needed now is continued pressure on the Iranians so that they actually understand that their power is greatly reduced. And that means building economic sanctions. It means maintaining political and diplomatic isolation of Iran until they shift. And it means maintaining credible deterrence so that the Iranians recognize they have no military avenue out of this thing. And then let them stew on that. And let them come to the conclusion that they can no longer really maintain a position of power. They've lost it. And so it's time to come with concessions in mind, not with a sense of pride.
Yeah, I want to read a little bit more of the article that I was just referring to and pick up on a couple of the points there, because you go on to say that in the past, it was Iran and its proxies that too often set the pace and the agenda of peace and war in the Middle East. It was Iran's threats and American weakness that compelled Arab states to hedge their policies and avoid provoking the beast. You go on to say that things have changed. I mean, what are the main changes? Just outline them for us.
Well, the Iranians' basic requirement of any state, sovereign state, is to deter attacks and defend their people. And they proved not only incapable of doing both, but they actually brought on the very thing that they said they were trying to avoid, which was a military campaign that no one really wanted against Iran because of the behavior of its proxies. Now they no longer have even an air defense system that's meaningfully, capable of defending their skies. So Israel, the United States, anybody else can wander with will across their airspace. So this is a devastating situation for an autocracy that's already not very popular. And the pillars of the regime at this point really were the IRGC. And they have been, their command and control has been decimated by Israeli actions and humiliated by the United States' ability to conduct this operation against their nuclear sites. So, there's no organized opposition in Iran, and I'm not predicting regime change overnight, but this is a regime that is they're on the ropes. They're in a terrible situation. And so that's why I think the tables are turned. That doesn't mean we go for regime change. I don't think an external strategy to do that is going to succeed. It would probably backfire, in fact, by building support for the regime. What we need to do is make sure everyone in the Middle East now understands that power has changed and that change is for the good.
So what you're basically saying is that Iran can no longer project power in the region the way it used to, at least not for quite some time to come.
That's right. And if we maintain that pressure and the Iranians come to the recognition that that is the new reality, then we can find ways to welcome them back, but based on mutual respect, based on respect for sovereignty. And there are deals that we can do that enable them to develop a nuclear energy program. There are deals we can do if they break their relations and we verify it with their proxies and with their campaign of terror, that we then offer non-aggression pacts. Or all kinds of things diplomacy can offer, but not yet. Timing is very important in statecraft and diplomacy. And I would let the Iranians understand more fully than today that they don't really have any options.
Right. So you're saying that it's not the moment to be rushing into premature deals. It's not the moment to be making concessions to Iran. I mean, does some of the US response feel like it's been a little bit on the hasty side to you these last few days?
I worry about that. I was concerned about the way the Trump administration rushed into negotiations in the first place, although it was clear that by last week, Trump had concluded that the Iranians were playing games with us. We're making no concessions. They wanted to drag this process out. You know, the history of American-Iranian relations is one in which they outlast us because they know American politicians lose patience and interest. We are on a 4-year electoral cycle. So if we don't deliver results every 2 to 4 years, we try something else. The Iranians never change. They've had 2 leaders in the last 40 years. So they just want to wait us out. And that's something we have to understand and not fall into that trap. Be persistent. Not bellicose, but be persistent in maintaining the pressure needed to make sure the Iranians actually behave like a responsible state.
But at the same time, you say, sorry to keep quoting your article back at you, but you said that Iran is at the weakest point it's been in since 1979. I mean, can they move forwards and rebuild? Because a lot of people in Israel, a lot of people in the United States, hoping that the leadership is a spent force. I mean, what's your assessment? Can they survive?
Yes, they can. They've survived a lot before. This is the worst point, but they've been at low points before. And they're a vicious authoritarian regime that has demonstrated an ability, unlike the Shah, that preceded them of actually eliminating the opposition. And I mean that word quite literally. So yeah, theoretically they can. And if we are not vigilant and if we do not come up with a smart strategy that combines military deterrence with good political diplomacy, then they will rebuild and they will rebuild their nuclear program. Whether they can do it in a matter of months or a matter of years is important, but geostrategically, the important thing is that we counter it. And we showed that we can, and they know that. And they will back down. They will make concessions. They will back down as they did in the 80s when we had a similar situation dealing with their attempt to close the Strait of Hormuz. We kept it open. We can do that again.
And there's a really big difference, isn't there, in approach towards Iran, depending on whether you're looking at it from the US point of view or whether you're looking at it from the Israeli point of view, because Prime Minister Netanyahu talks about securing the region for generations as far as he and his people are concerned. And you've been saying as well that a US president tends not to look beyond the 2 to 4 year electoral cycle. I mean, there's a mismatch here, isn't there, in terms of who wants to achieve what and when? How do they reconcile that, do you think?
Well, it's a mismatch. I mean, we don't live in the region. I mean, we have soldiers and embassies there, but we're so far away that we're not going to, and it's not reasonable to expect the American people to feel the same sense of urgency and threat that people living in the shadow of these missiles feels. Although we need to communicate as effectively as possible to Congress and the public why we do what we do. The other thing pushing us is the military and a lot of other people in this administration and around believe that we should be de-emphasizing the Middle East and putting more of our assets in East Asia to counter the larger, longer-term threat of China. I don't disagree with that, but so long as the Middle East is in turmoil, we can't really pull out of the Middle East because it won't allow us to, and there's too much at stake in terms of the sources of energy and the economic centrality of the Middle East. So that's why this is a golden opportunity. For the first time in my career, a 40-year career, I have seen the chance where we can actually make permanent a reversal of fortune of the Iranians. It doesn't mean keep bombing them. It means keeping the pressure on.
Right, and I'm wondering how much pressure is being felt internally, because, a lot of people, and I have garnered from this conversation as well, you're saying that the Iranian leadership have lost some of their legitimacy. But I'm wondering if that sentiment is widespread in Iran itself, whether these last 12 days of violence have changed anything, or has it simply brought more people rallying around the Iranian flag?
I don't know, and I doubt very many people can judge that yet. I don't know how reliable opinion polling is in a place like Iran. All I know is based on experience that In a situation like this, people are probably blaming, I mean, ordinary people are blaming everybody. They're certainly not friendly toward the United States. Certainly, if you've suffered losses of loved ones, you think about who's bombing you. But you also think about the regime that's one value. It's not a democracy. It's not producing a strong economy. It's not promoting human rights, but it is claiming to defend you. And it failed in that one basic requirement. And I can't help but think that's sinking in today in Iran.
Sure. And I want to ask you, casting your mind back to when you were U.S. Special Envoy for Peace in the Middle East. And we've been given to understand these last few days that there's been direct and indirect contact between Washington and Tehran. Tell us a bit about the indirect contact. What form does that typically take? Well,
in this instance, the Omanis, the leadership in the Sultanate of Oman, have traditionally played that role. They're a peaceful country. They have no great power ambitions, and they have good communication channels with both the United States and with Iran. So they're an ideal partner. They were the ones who helped us get through the JCPOA breakthroughs. And I think those indirect channels are very important. I also hope that we find ways to continue direct communication. That's not inconsistent with maintaining pressure. Those tools are important to avoid misunderstandings and make sure the Iranians understand we're not against them as a people or a country. We're against a regime that wants to dominate its neighborhood. Once it recognizes that the geostrategic balance of power in the Middle East, the landscape of the region has changed, we'd love to live with them again. Those are messages we need to convey directly and indirectly.
China and Russia presumably watching what's been happening with considerable interest. They are allies of Iran. How do you interpret their view of all of this? And could they, and if so, how, perhaps come to Iran's aid and help it restore some of its regional influence?
I tend to diminish their role. I could be proven wrong, but Putin didn't do anything to save Bashar al-Assad. So, including the use of his air force. Assad made a panic call at the last minute, and the Russians were preoccupied with their own problems, and they have a handful in Ukraine. So I don't think there's much hope there. As for the Chinese, there was a lot of talk about the Chinese being a new presence in the Middle East once they brokered the restoration of relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. They've been absent. They've been invisible. They've been neutral. They're doing nothing to help the Iranians. They don't want the Iranians to go, I think, too far, because if there's actual disruption of oil supplies, the Chinese would be the ones to suffer the most. But they don't have the ability to project power, and they expect the United States to sort these things out at our price rather than they're bearing a price.
So the fact that Russia didn't come to Iran's aid, the fact, as you mentioned, they didn't come to the aid of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, who was also their ally, I mean, what does that tell us about Russia today? Well,
if Vladimir Putin's your only best friend in the world, good luck, because he's not going to help you. And even Lukashenko right next door in Belarus is trying to find ways to diversify his relationships. So, Putin's not going away. Russia's a power that will use its military and other means to project it in its neighborhood. It really can't project power much beyond that, including in the Middle East, as we have seen.
Okay, just to sort of wrap up, I mean, Tehran was obviously having to get used to this second Trump administration and its way of saying things, its methods, communications, timing of actions. How do you think Tehran is adapting to the realities of Trump 2.0?
Well, there are a number of things to know about the Iranians, and I'm sure you and your viewers do, but to recapitulate, one is that they are very good at reading power, and they're very good at understanding the United States and our decision-making, usually. Many of their senior diplomats were educated in the United States and presumably have some sway with the clerical and security leaders who actually make the decisions. But they blundered terribly right now. I mean, they made a series of miscalculations, of colossal errors. And they must be absorbing that. Whatever their propaganda and their bluster may be, they have to know deep down that they have suffered greatly. So again, my expectation based on the past is they're going to want to lay low. Just cool it out, chill it out, honor the ceasefires, do nothing. That's where they were before this campaign started. Since the end of last year, they've said almost nothing offensive. And they tried to enter into talks, but they were not good faith. So we have to call them out on that stuff and demand that when you are ready, come to us with serious proposals, not with a bunch of talk.
All right, well, we're going to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate it. David Hale, former US Special Envoy for Peace in the Middle East. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you, Tom.
Well, as we've been saying, the ceasefire deal between Israel and Iran took effect yesterday, on Tuesday, on what was the 12th day of the war. Well, despite some early accusations of violations on both sides, signs of normalcy are reported to be gradually returning to life in Iran and Israel. Well, the Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian has indicated that his country is ready to resolve issues at the negotiating table. Well, the death toll from Israeli strikes across Iran since the 13th of June stands at 606, whilst in Israel, 28 fatalities have been reported. Well, today, flights at Israel's main Ben Gurion airport have gradually been returning to normal. Let's get more now. We can speak to Chuck Freilich, who is a former Israeli Deputy National Security Advisor who joins us from Tel Aviv. You're also a senior fellow at the INSS in Tel Aviv. Thank you very much. Always a pleasure talking to you. We're being told that planes in and out of Israel's main Ben Gurion airport have been resuming normal operations. I mean, 12 days of hostilities behind the country. Does it feel like things have returned to normal there in Israel?
Israel has always demonstrated a remarkable resiliency, a remarkable ability to return to normal life after wars, terrorism, intifada. So the war ended the day before yesterday. Today, was it yesterday? Everybody's back at work, kids are at schools, the airport's opening. Within a couple of days, I think we'll almost forget at least the impact on civilian life.
Okay, I mean, the ceasefire is being described as fragile and it had a slightly rocky start. Are you confident it's going to hold?
Well, I'm certainly not confident because we have to see what Iran does, and Iran is, if anything, a somewhat unpredictable actor. But the rocky start was, I would say, almost par for the course for this type of thing. Ceasefires with Hamas and Hezbollah over the years have never taken hold immediately, and I frankly didn't expect this one either. It was only a few hours behind schedule, so I wouldn't attach too much importance to that.
Okay, where could we go to from here? Could this ceasefire be a first step towards a longer-term peace agreement, or is that, or am I getting ahead of myself?
Well, if you're talking a peace agreement between Israel and Iran, then yes, I think you're certainly getting way ahead of yourself. I think what we can hope for is that the U.S. reaches a new deal with Iran, which locks in the achievements of the war, which really prevents Iran from being able to reconstitute a military nuclear program for decades to come, which addresses their ballistic and other missile and drone arsenals, and which hopefully, to my way of thinking, this is less critical, but which hopefully addresses their so-called malign regional behavior or their regional expansionism. I say less that I think that that's less critical at the moment because Iran has been taken down so severely since last fall, whether it's Iran itself, whether it's Hezbollah, Hamas. Be nice to have, but that one I am less worried about.
Are there people in Israel who feel that this ceasefire was premature and that perhaps there was still some fighting to be done?
Well, that's always the case, and sure there were some people who felt that way, but I don't think that either the government or the IDF felt that way. They wanted to bring the war to an end, both to, let's say, lock in the achievements that had been made. In war, you never know what might happen, what might go wrong. So there was that dimension to it. There was the fact that the home front in Israel was taking a hit, and The government wanted to end that as quickly as possible. And then, of course, there was American pressure to do so. So there wasn't much pressure that I can think of from anyone in Israel to continue much more.
I mean, there's been quite rapid rapprochement, just reading between the lines and listening to what the US president has been saying, between him and Iran. I mean, we went from a situation where the Iranians were striking US military interests in the Middle East to the US president brokering a ceasefire deal and saying that, and in fact, sounding more irritated with Israel than he did with Iran, listening to what he said on Tuesday. I mean, does part of you say, not so fast?
Yeah. Look, Mr. Trump is a man of, shall we say, or a president of unusual rhetoric and an unusual way of directing, of leading American foreign policy. Okay. Remember, he had just launched a major military operation against Iran and had provided very strong backing for Israel throughout. Yes, there was a moment there of exasperation on his part, that was clear. But Israel then ceded to his request. I think for me, the real question now is, can we reach a long-term deal which essentially or effectively closes off Iran's path to a nuclear weapon? And if the US can do that, then I think the entire region will come out ahead. And if the US can even lead to a breakthrough to peaceful relations with Iran, a great deal has to happen. I mean, there are 50 steps before that. But if we can just lock in, as I'm saying, the long-term nuclear deal and hopefully the missile arsenal, this will be a huge change for the better for the entire Middle East.
The United States president says that the Iranian nuclear program has been obliterated. Not everyone in the US intelligence sort of world seems to agree with that. I'm wondering what Israel's assessment is. Is Israel convinced that that nuclear program has been stopped in its tracks?
Well, I think first of all, we're talking about the American intelligence assessment. There was an early assessment by the Defense Intelligence Agency and the Pentagon, which was assessed at a low level of confidence. So even they weren't very confident in what they were saying. And I must say, I was quite surprised that they came out with that quite as quickly as they did, because the bombs had barely stopped falling. And it was clear that they didn't yet have significant BDA bomb damage assessment. And it'll probably take weeks before we really know in detail what happened there. So I'm less concerned about that. And it's come out today in public that the Israel Atomic Energy Committee assesses that the Fordo plant the enrichment plant was hit very hard, and that it will have set the program back by a good number of years. And there have been other press reports in Israel saying that the Israeli assessment is 2 years. I think it's quite premature for us to really know what happened. Iran was hit very hard. Iran will have to take into account that should it try to reconstitute the program, that it is so remarkably penetrated on an intelligence level that it is almost unimaginable that it won't be caught. And that would then invite another attack. So we'll see. But I think we've gained some time.
It was a big risk, wasn't it, politically, for Mr. Trump to throw his support behind those US strikes? A lot of people in his own party didn't like him doing that and tried to talk him out of it. He went ahead with it. Does that make him a stronger world leader, do you think? The fact that he has been vindicated for his call there?
Well, I think the source of the opposition, which was there among the so-called MAGA isolationists and certainly in the Democratic Party, was really a fear that this would lead to some sort of escalation and maybe even a regional-wide escalation. And I think maybe the president himself was afraid of that, but in any event, he shut it down very quickly. Okay, this was basically a one-off. He hit 3 targets, and that was it. So at that point, the dangers of escalation were minimal. I think that they were, to my own opinion, is that they were greatly overblown to begin with, because for Iran to escalate, whether to hit American forces in the region, to hit American allies in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and others, that would invite the kind of major, if not massive, American involvement that they didn't want. So I don't think that he was actually taking that big a risk here. And in retrospect, everyone will have to, I think we'll have to recognize it.
What was the signal that Iran was sending, do you think, on Monday with its attack on the US base in Doha? What was that about, do you think?
Well, I think the Iranians had to do something just as a minimal face-saving measure to say, we hit back. But they wanted to end the war. The side that was clearly pushing for an early end to this was Iran. So they went through the motions and the war ended.
In terms of what impact these events have on other global issues, in particular ones relating to Israel, I want to ask you about what the Israeli Prime Minister has been saying. Benjamin Netanyahu says that Israel's, and the US attacks on Iranian nuclear and missile facilities could help end the conflict in Gaza. Hamas also today saying that talks have, quote, intensified. How do you see these events being connected?
Well, I'm not sure that there really is a direct correlation. There could be. You know, if Mr. Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to say, well, having had this big success, having been vindicated for decades, he's been waiting for this to happen and preparing for it. Now maybe he doesn't need the ultra right-wing part of his coalition. Maybe he's even willing to risk going to early election. The elections must be held by November 26th, but he can move them up anytime he wants. Maybe he'll do that, and then under those circumstances, he would want a hostage deal, and he'd be willing to make some of the concessions that Hamas is demanding. That's one possibility. And Hamas has got to be feeling even more isolated, alone in the world than it was just a few days ago, because now their primary ally, Iran, has been hit very, very hard. I'm not sure that either of these factors will really make a big difference. I think Hamas wants a deal. They've wanted it for a long time. Israel does. And the problem is the sticking point, and the same one that's been there the whole time. Hamas has demanded a absolute, complete end to the war and a complete Israeli withdrawal, and Israel saying, no, we're not willing to withdraw completely, and promise you that the war is over. If you reconstitute, we will have to be able to attack you once again.
But in the same way that President Trump put considerable pressure on Israel and Iran to accept the terms of the ceasefire that he brokered, to draw a line under the 12-day war, and we've heard President Trump saying just in the last couple of days, great progress, he says, is being made to end the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza. I wonder if you see President Trump similarly imposing a deadline for a full cessation of hostilities. Do you think he's likely to do that?
Well, first of all, I don't think he imposed a ceasefire on Israel. I think Israel wanted it, and maybe there was a difference about how the last hours should be conducted. There is a possibility that Trump will try to do what you're suggesting. It is certainly possible. He hasn't put pressure on Israel in regard to Gaza since coming into office. And I don't know that that's going to change, but people speculate that there was shall we call it I will support you in Iran in exchange for you then giving me the end to the war in Gaza. It's a possibility.
I mean, for people around the world, there's a huge amount of sympathy for the people of Gaza, 2 million people living in famine-like conditions. And they will be, I think people are extremely alarmed by what they see on their screens every day, and it's not getting any easier after 20 months of seeing those images. I mean, is there an end game, do you think? Does Prime Minister Netanyahu have an end game for Gaza?
First of all, I wouldn't talk about famine-like conditions, because if you use that terminology, then I would suggest going back to media reports, if not the first, then certainly by the second week of the war. The international media, including the leading outlets, have been speaking about famine ever since then.
Just to pick you up on that, I don't want to interrupt you, sir, but we are being told that by people on the ground who work for organizations like UNICEF, and people who are seeing it with their own eyes.
But everybody would be dead if there had been famine for 20 months. And the international aid organizations, on the one hand, some of them are really wonderful organizations, and the people are highly motivated, but they are international aid organizations. And that is their focus, humanitarian care. When they see people who are undoubtedly living in very unpleasant circumstances and things are not great, it speaks to them. They have a professional interest, a vested interest, an emotional interest in overstating things. If there was real famine in Gaza after 20 months, I don't think anybody would be alarmed.
Well, you've probably seen the pictures of emaciated children, and you've probably read the reports of dozens of children dying of malnutrition. So, I think it's very hard to dispute that, isn't it?
Yeah, and I also know that there was the Deputy Secretary General of the UN who, about a week before the war, came out with a statement saying that within 2 days, 14,000 infants were going to die in Gaza. And really, I don't know if one or two or a few did. And of course, that would be a few too many. But this is so overstated. I really think that people have to stop restating this. Life isn't good in Gaza. No one is debating that. But just by the way, the only people who actually may be suffering starvation are the Israeli hostages.
Well, I mean, we've spoken to people who've been profoundly traumatized by what they've seen in Gaza. I don't know if that information is shared widely in Israel, but people I've spoken to, grown men who've traveled the world doing aid work, who've worked in some of the most horrific conditions imaginable, have been almost at a loss for words and visibly absolutely horrified by what they've seen. So I have to sort of stand my ground on that. But let's go back to...
I'll stand on mine. So that's fine.
All right, well, let's wrap up. I just want to go back to where things stand with regards to Israel and Iran. The 2015 nuclear agreement is obviously in the bin. Just looking forwards, 10 years on, are we going to see a new and better deal being struck, or is it not about deals at this stage?
Well, I very much hope that we are talking about a new deal, because as successful as both the American and Israeli attacks hopefully were, it's at best a stopgap measure. It can give us maybe a few-year postponement of the Iranian program. The only way to ensure a long-term end to it, or a permanent end or long-term postponement, is through a new deal. And this deal, to my way of thinking, has to be decades long. It has to either ban enrichment in Iran completely, or maybe it can be limited to the 3.67, the civilian level. It has to deal with Iran's missile systems and arsenals, and maybe with their regional behavior. It's going to be hard to get there. Iran is a proud nation, and they were humiliated here. It will not be easy for them to come back to the table, let alone make the concession. But if not, then we may be back to military action, not tomorrow, but not in the very distant future either.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Appreciate you taking the time to speak to us, Chuck Freilich. Thank you very much indeed. Well, that is all we have time for on today's edition of GNT. Thanks for watching. We've talked about the situation between Israel and Iran, the end of the so-called 12-day war. We've talked about the progress that's been made diplomatically. And we've also heard as well about what impact this could have for the situation in Gaza. Could this be a catalyst for a conclusion to the 20 months of war between Israel and Hamas? That's all been under discussion today. Thanks for watching. Look forward to seeing you again tomorrow.